Welcome to the Tabletop Empire. My name is Nate, and today we are continuing our discussion on combat and conflict in Star Wars RPG. In this video, I will be covering everything that you need to know about range bands, combat modifiers, and environmental effects. There's a lot to dive into, so let's just go ahead and get on into it. Range, the distance between 2 points, most often you, the player, and the other person you're trying to. This game handles range in what are called range bands. The first band is more like a dot and is the engaged range. This will be when you are within fist or sword damage and is used for any brawl, melee, or lightsaber attacks, as well as when the player is close enough to an item to use it, so directly next to you kind of thing. Next we have the short range, and the book states this is within several meters, and in this range you can talk to somebody without raised voices. Medium is up to several dozen meters away. Long is what's past a few dozen meters, and then the extreme range is the furthest range possible. And at extreme range, you may not hear somebody even if they're shouting at you. These are not hard set in stone numbers on the range bands, but to give a different visual, here's how I personally interpret range in comparison to an American football field, which is 100 yards long or 91.44 meters. Short range would be at the 3-yard line and closer. Medium range would be up to the 50-yard line. Long would be from the 50-yard to 100-yard line, and then extreme is anything past that. But again, that's just how I interpret it. It's up to each GM's own interpretation. If you end up learning something new in this video, be sure to blast that like button. Thanks. Now there are a lot of additional combat modifiers in this game, so if you need to rewatch this section, please do, though I will do my best to explain it in a way that you get it on the first try. The first combat modifier is when you're making a ranged attack against multiple targets who are all within the engaged range next to each other. So if both characters in this situation are enemies, then there is no modifier. However, if there is an ally also in engaged range to your target, then the attacker upgrades difficulty of the check one time, and if there is a despair rolled, the shot will hit somebody else engaged with the target instead of who you were initially aiming for, and it's the GM's choice of who. The next modifier is making ranged attacks while the attacker is engaged to the target. When's the wedding? No, just kidding. It can be hard to aim and shoot someone when they are swinging a sword at you, so if you're using a ranged light weapon, then it's +1 difficulty. If heavy, then +2, and gunnery checks are not possible at this range. On top of this, the person with the sword or making any melee or brawl check with the shooter may take a boost die on their next attack as long as both targets stay in engaged range. Modifier number 3 is attacking while prone or attacking somebody who is prone. So any player who is knocked out, unconscious, or willingly drops prone is considered prone. When attacking somebody who's prone with a melee brawl or lightsaber, you add 1 boost die to your attack. If you are prone and attacking with a melee brawl or lightsaber, then you take 1 setback dice. And if you are attacking somebody who is prone with ranged, then you take a setback dice. Next, we have 2-weapon combat or dual wielding. This is when you have 2 one-handed weapons or something like a dual-sided lightsaber. So to make this attack, you first want to do what's called a combined check. So first, the player determines which weapon is the primary weapon and which is secondary. They then determine which skills and characteristics are needed for each, as well as who you want to attack. You then take the lower skill and the lower characteristic of the 2 weapons. For difficulty, if they're the same base difficulty, then you roll 1 extra difficulty dice. If they are different difficulties, then you roll the harder of the 2 and then add 2 more difficulty dice to that. If you succeed the check, then attack with primary weapon, and then you can spend 2 advantage or a triumph to attack with the secondary weapon, and then any further advantage or triumphs can be used as weapon qualities from either weapon. The 5th modifier is unarmed combat for when your fists or feet or some other appendage is needed for the fight. Generally, this will be the brawl combat skill. Damage is your brawn plus successes. It's going to have a crit rating of 5 and the disorient 1 and knockdown qualities. You can also choose to target strain instead of wounds, but either way you still account for soak. When using brawl weapons, you add that damage to what you would normally do, as well as it may improve the crit rating and all the qualities of that weapon to the pre-existing 2. If it is an improved quality, then you take the better one. Number 6 is improvised weapons. For those of you who may want to grab a table leg or a mug of nog or a rock and attack with it. You roll melee and automatically add a threat to the result of the roll. If the results include 2 threat or despair, then the improvised weapon breaks. Damage and stats depend on the size of the item, which I'll list here. Damage here is brawn plus success plus damage listed. And the last modifier is size or silhouettes. The idea here is that some targets are going to be a little bit harder or easier to hit depending on their size. So if you're attacking something that has a silhouette of 2 or more than your character, then you reduce the difficulty by 1, and if you're attacking something 2 or more silhouettes smaller than your character, then you increase the difficulty by 1. And there's a full chart of all the silhouettes and examples in your book. Now, I admit that is a lot of info. However, I'm going to be coming out soon with the GM screen that you guys can use that'll have all of this stuff on it for reference. If this is something you might be interested in, please subscribe, keep an eye on our community tab here, as well as join our Discord, so that way you know when it comes out. Now, the Star Wars universe has plenty of environments for the players to explore and build stories in. And thankfully, the book also has some rules on how you can interpret this into your gameplay. So let's cover concealment, cover, terrain, gravity, water, vacuums, fire and acid, corrosive atmospheres, suffocation, and falling. Concealment can come from darkness, smoke, or intervening terrain. Any exact bonuses or modifiers can be determined by the GM if needed. Concealment adds a setback dice to ranged combat and perception checks, and adds boost die to stealth checks, though this can be applied to other skills if the GM deems it appropriate. The number of setbacks and boosts is determined by what is doing the concealing. So for example, mist or waist-high grass would add 1, fog or early morning / late evening darkness or shoulder-high grass adds 2, and heavy fog, choking smoke, and darkness of night would add 3 dice. When in a fight and the player dives behind cover, add 1 setback die to attacks made against that player, since they are now harder to hit. This may also add a setback to certain checks like perception. The GM may add a second setback die if the player is particularly well covered. Difficult terrain is a catch-all description and can include tight passageways, slippery ice, waist-high water, shifting sand, and so on. To move through these, the players will need to use twice as many maneuvers as they would on normal terrain. Impassable terrain is terrain that is impossible to move through using maneuvers, such as climbing a steep cliff or deep pits. This is not completely impossible terrain, but it will take special skills to circumvent, such as athletics or coordination, and may require both an action and a maneuver to cross, as well as potentially any other advantage the enemy may receive. Gravity. Heavier than normal gravity can add up to 3 setback dice to coordination and any brawn-based skills, with the exception of resilience. Lighter than normal gravity, on the other hand, adds up to 3 boost die on the same checks. The amount of dice depends on how heavy or light the gravity difference is. 0 gravity, however, gives no boosts or setbacks, and instead all maneuvers count as difficult terrain. Encumbrance does not change due to gravity. A suffocating character suffers 3 strain at the start of each of their turns. Once exceeding the strain threshold, you become incapacitated. In addition, each subsequent round still suffocating adds a critical injury. This continues until the player has either stopped suffocating or they die, whichever comes first. Water is a thing that exists in Star Wars, and so naturally, swimming is too. Swimming counts as a difficult terrain. If the player can submerge and hold their breath, they can do that for as many rounds as their brawn. After that point, the player is now drowning and is treated with the suffocation rules on each successive round until coming up for air. A vacuum is not just the lack of air, but also the lack of pressure and extreme heat or cold, which can cause all sorts of issues with the body. I won't go into gory detail here on specifics, but when in a vacuum, the player can hold their breath for as many rounds as their brawn, but they also take 3 wounds each round while in a vacuum. Once you reach your wound threshold, you become incapacitated and take a critical injury on that round, and every round after that, you are still exposed to the vacuum. This is on top of any critical injuries obtained from suffocation. Next up is fire, acid, and corrosive atmospheres. Each of these are generally treated by the same rules. The GM will determine the severity and rate it from 1 to 10, although higher ratings may apply. Each round, the players will suffer wounds equal to the rating at the start of the player's turn. The damage persists until no longer exposed to the hazard. The GM may decide it's only toxic if inhaled, so holding your breath or gas mask can help there. It is primarily up to the GM for how long these hazards last. Acids typically negate themselves after a certain period of time. Fires burn as long as there is a fuel source, very briefly or for a very long time. A victim may be able to stop damage from fire by rolling around on the ground using coordination, stop, drop, and roll. This is an average check on hard surfaces and an easy check on soft surfaces like grass. Jumping in water stops damage immediately. In the case of acid, the GM decides what procedure is possible to stop the damage. The only way to stop damage from corrosive atmosphere, though, is to leave it. And last but not least, we have falling, good old fall damage. When falling, the GM will decide the distance between where the character falls from and the impact point below. Then apply the closest comparable range band. Then consult this table to determine damage suffered. Soak will apply to wounds suffered, but not strain. A character can reduce damage from falling using an athletics or coordination average difficulty check, and each success will negate 1 damage taken, and each advantage reduces 1 strain taken. Now, Triumph can be used at GM and player discretion, but you can use it to reduce the range band for the damage by 1. If you guys have any questions here, please leave a comment down below. I do my best to answer to each and every one. If you are new here, this is part of an ongoing series where we go through the entire core rulebook from start to finish, chapter by chapter, and we break down the core concepts seen in each chapter. This is part 2 of chapter 6, so if you want to start from the beginning, there's a link down in the description below that you can check out. And be sure to blast that like button and subscribe so you can see the rest of the series. Thank you so much for watching. I will see you in the next one, but until then, and as always, may the force be with you.